when you take all of these kind of dimensions and put them together, you get kind of this continuum where some things are going from eaten to uneaten. Inflection versus derivation. I received someone looking through my personal files the other day. Dog of, I don't know, war. Chew quickly. That's fairly self-explanatory. All right, so then let's talk about a bit of morphology now that we've talked about phonology for a while. See if this works. Let's talk about a morpheme. A word that I don't think I can spend 5 minutes conlaying without saying. So what is a morpheme? A morpheme is the smallest pairing of sound and meaning in a language. That's at least one way to define it. So let's look at a word like goodness. Goodness is a word that has 2 morphemes in it. Why? Because we can break it down. We can take it apart, and the pieces have meaning. So we can break goodness down into good, and then this Ness bit that doesn't show up on its own, but nevertheless seems to allow, it seems to contribute something, turning good, which is an adjective, into a goodness, which is a noun. But then if we want to go further, we can't break down good into anything. It's just good. It's an atom in a way. It can't be divided. So there's an atom in the literal sense of the word. So good cannot be divided. Ness cannot be divided. There's no part to good that retains this idea of a pairing of sound and meaning. We can, however, break down good into parts that are pure sound. So, of course, good is 1 syllable. We know how to decompose syllables now, so it contains an onset, a nucleus, and a coda. We can do that, but the onset does not have its own meaning. The coda does not have its own meaning. And so this is why good is a morpheme. Sometimes you can have a very abstract notion of a morpheme, so we can talk about a word like record, with the stress here, and record with the stress here on the second syllable. And clearly these 2 words are related in some way. What's happened is when we have record the noun and record the verb, something has changed, which is the stress pattern. And so we can look at the stress pattern as a morpheme of its own, if we want, if we're so inclined. We can think of this, whatever it is, this sort of floating stress pattern as a morpheme that turns a noun into a verb. That's one analysis anyway. So you can get quite abstract with these morphemes, if you so desire. And there's, I'd be lying if I didn't acknowledge, or if I didn't say that there was some controversy in the field about exactly how to define a morpheme. But this is a good working definition that I think as a conlanger you can pretty much accept and work with. Okay, so now that we're talking about morphemes, we can talk about different kinds of morphemes. So what would be one way of slicing up the different types of morphemes? Well, we can talk about inflection versus derivation. This is a tough one. Let's see how fast I can get at this. Boom. Okay. So we can talk about inflection versus derivation. What's the difference between inflection and derivation? So inflection and derivation. Let's see, do I have enough space for this? Derivation are 2 types of morphology. We can start in on this by examples. So inflection refers to cases like subject-verb agreement that we see in English. So I eat, but she eats. This kind of s morpheme that shows up on the end of the verb here is an inflectional morpheme, or the plural morpheme in English. Dog, dogs. Here we have Another morpheme that happens to have the same shape, actually, more or less, as the third person singular agreement marker, we see as the plural marker. And these are inflectional morphemes. Now let's take a look at derivational morphemes and see sort of how we can divide these two. So derivational morphemes would be things like our example from before, which was good plus Ness. So we're changing the adjective into a noun. Good, goodness. This is an instance of derivation. Or something like, if you want a really long one, which I'm not going to write because it'll take too long, anti-disestablishmentarianism has a ton of derivational morphology that all sort of pile onto this one root, establish. So you get the disestablish, disestablishment, anti-disestablishment. You're getting more and more things like this coming on. If you were to pluralize anti-disestablishmentarianism, anti-disestablishmentarianisms, then you'd start to get into the realm of inflectional morphology. So we have this distinction. How are we going to come up with a definition that seems to fit this kind of intuitive distinction that we have? I'm seeing someone in the chat saying that the signal's interrupted. I hope not. I hope that... okay, so some people are saying that it's okay. Yeah, let me know if there's anything I can do. I will definitely fiddle with controls and try and make it so that the signal's better. But okay, so derivation versus inflection. So what's going on here? We have things like goodness. We have things like what would be a good uneaten, right? This would be another instance of derivational morphology, going from eaten to uneaten. We're essentially what we're doing is we're forming kind of a new core meaning. We're not just fiddling with grammatical features. So how can we divide these things? So inflection deals with categories that are relevant to the syntax. So things like agreement are expressed by like agreement. So we have the subject-verb agreement on eat versus eats. This is expressed by inflectional morphology. Inflectional morphology is usually obligatory. So if you have a third person singular present tense verb in English and you want to inflect, or if you have a subject that's in the third person, you want to put a present tense verb that agrees with it, you have to agree with it. So you can't, in standard English, say he eat. It would have to be he eats. And so that's another hallmark of inflectional morphology, is that it's obligatory. So it's relevant to syntax. It's obligatory. It does not change the core meaning of the word. So something like dog versus dogs, we're still talking fundamentally about dog. It's just that there's more than one of them in one case. Another thing about inflectional morphology is that it's compositional. Compositionality is what happens when the meaning of the whole is predictable from the meanings of the parts. So dog, singular, dog plus plural, plural of dogs, many dogs. By contrast, derivation is often non-compositional. So we have something like the verb ignore. When we put a noun-forming subject uns onto it, getting ignorance, ignorance is not the quality of ignoring something. If I'm ignoring something, someone can't tell me, hey, stop your ignorance. Ignorance is something else. And so this is the kind of non-compositional property that can arise when you have derivational morphology. Doesn't seem to be the case with inflectional morphology. Inflectional morphology, so we're back over into this column here, often has a relatively abstract meaning. So plurality is an abstract meaning. Past tense is an abstract grammatical meaning. The meaning in derivation is often more concrete, although that's debatable. Whether turning a verb into a noun is concrete, I don't know. but this is one characteristic that people have proposed. Inflection never changes the word class or the part of speech. So you are going from a noun, dog, to a noun in the plural, dogs. You're going from a verb, eat, to a verb inflected for person and number, eats. Or a verb inflected for tense, eat to ate. And with derivation, you often get changes in word class. So we have good turning from an adjective to a noun with goodness, or ignorance, ignore, changing from a verb to a noun. So you often get these word class changes with derivation. Not always. Uneaten, adjective to adjective. So when you take all of these kind of dimensions and put them together, you get kind of this continuum where some things are kind of more inflectional and some things are more derivational. But it is, although it's a very hard thing to define, it's very useful. And so we can think of it as a kind of a continuum between these two types of morphology. A language that has little to no inflection, so I'm here for a good time asks, can a language that has little to no inflection have a lot of derivational morphology? And absolutely it can. And you do get this in some languages of, I believe in the Austronesian family in Southeast Asia. Could be wrong about that. That's just what pops into my mind. Okay, so inflection versus derivation. Let's break for me to fiddle with the blackboard again. Great. Nope, we don't want it all red. Let's go back to this. Okay. So, stay limber. You got to be limber for linguistics. It's so important. It's so important. So we were talking about a word like goodness, and we saw that there were two parts, good and Ness, and we called these parts morphemes. And what is the difference between these two morphemes? Good can stand on its own. You can say that is good, right? But Ness cannot. That's why I've drawn a little hyphen to the left of it. So we would say good is a free morpheme, and Ness is a bound morpheme. So you cannot have Ness on its own. That's what makes it a bound morpheme. That's I don't know, I guess I don't have to go into huge amount of detail about that. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. We often write bound morphemes with these little hyphens on one side or another to indicate that they have to attach to something else. You know, Moontruther, you can make it happen. Make it happen. Make Ness into a free morpheme. So let's divide morphemes into other kinds of categories that are important. I briefly mentioned when we were talking about anti-disestablishmentarianism, the concept of a root. So if we look at goodness, if we look at dogs, if we look at untrue, if we look at anti-disestablishmentarianism, all of these have something at their core. Let's just get some more space here so I can write something like dogs. We have goodness, we have dogs, we have untrue, we have anti-disestablishmentarianism. I'll just put establishment here because I think that gets the point across as well. And each of these has a morpheme inside them that carries the kind of principal meaning of the word. So in the case of goodness, if you were to decide between the two of good and Ness, which is the kind of core of the meaning of the word, we would have to say good, because Ness just adds this kind of relatively abstract quality of being a noun, whereas good contains the real semantic content. So good, dogs, here we have a case of inflection, but it's a similar case because the plural morpheme just indicates plurality. It doesn't indicate the sort of the semantic core of the word, which is dog. So we have good, we have dogs, untrue. Okay, we have un, which is a sort of a negating morpheme, and true, which is the core. So we have true here. Establishment, another case of derivation, where we have the suffix ment, which is like a nominalizing suffix, something that makes it into a noun, establishes a verb, gets turned into a noun with ment. So the core of the meaning is here in establishment, in establish. Ignore the messiness. This morpheme that forms the core is called the root. So good, dogs, true, establishment, these are the roots. Roots can be, usually in English at least, roots are free morphemes. And it's the things that get added to them which are bound. But there are some cases in English where you have a root that is bound itself. An example would be in the word receive. Here our root is sieve. We know sieve sort of is its own thing because it occurs in tons of different words. Receive, deceive, conceive, all of these things. But sieve can't exist on its own. You can't say, I sieved someone looking through my personal files the other day. Or whatever meaning you would want to give to that. You can't use it on its own. Raven, there's nothing below it. It's just the underline. So don't worry. I'm a bit reticent to move things too much. Here we go. You can see the whole underline there. But thanks for the warning. Okay, so yeah, sieve is a bound root. Many languages have bound roots. English is not one of them. That has very many anyway. All right. So we talked about these roots. We should also talk about stems. Now, in the case of good, in the case of goodness, we have a root good. We have goodness. Goodness doesn't really, not a lot gets done to it. I guess you could pluralize it. You could say goodnesses. People, I suppose, don't say that a lot. But if you were to say goodnesses, you could distinguish between the root goodness and the root good and the stem goodness. So what is a stem? A stem is a bit of morphological structure, which could have many morphemes in it, that forms the base to which inflectional morphology attaches. So it might have been a bit abstract. Let me give you an example. So establishment can be pluralized to establishments. So in order to give, to make a distinction between what's going on at the base of the word before we do any inflection to it and the ultimate root of the word itself, we have this concept of a stem. So here, establish is the root and establishment is the stem. Often you will get cases where the root and the stem are the same, like dogs. So here, dog is the root and the stem. So go over here and stem. Here, goodness is the stem and untrue is the stem. So we have roots and stems. Roots are the sort of semantic, the morpheme, the single morpheme that constitutes the semantic core, and the stem is the thing to which inflection happens. Okay, roughly speaking. Going to catch up on the chat a little bit. Could the root of establishment be stable? You could make that case. I think it would really depend on... So obviously the etymological root of establishment is something like stable. But we'd have to wonder then, okay, so if that's true, what are the morphemes that are getting attached to it in order to change stable to establish, to establish. And so we'd have to account for this at the start, which doesn't seem to have a lot of other uses in English. Maybe special to especial, maybe. And then this ish. So is ish itself a morpheme that changes something into a verb? Maybe you could say polish, finish. We do seem to have it in a lot of verbs, but it's hard to extract it and turn it into its own morpheme. So I think for simplicity's sake, I would say establish is a morpheme, something that can't be analyzed, but I could definitely see a case for doing the opposite. Fundamentally, we're trying to characterize what the speakers of the language know, tacitly know. And if there's no way in which stable contributes meaning, or there are alternations, or there are ways in which speakers show that they are aware that there's a stable inside established, then I would argue against it. There are different kinds of things you could do. You could do experiments to see whether something like stable primes makes you more quickly to react to click a button to establishment rather than something else. Those are kinds of experiments that you could do. Yeah, so, okay, roots and stems. One more thing, maybe two more things. Yeah, because I want to talk about affixes and I want to talk about clitics, because I sort of gave a very brief definition of clitics that was sort of, I don't know. I'd like to have something a little more definitive. So let's pause briefly for me to delete everything on the screen. There must be a better way than this, but I don't know it. Okay. But look at the speed. Great. So we talked about bound morphemes and free morphemes. So we have our goodness here. Again, we have good plus Ness. When a bound morpheme is joined to a root or stem, we call that an affix. So here we have an affix. And if we wanted to have a word like untrue, here we have a prefix, because true is the root, good is the root, and un is the affix. So we'll call this an affix as well. Because it goes before the root, we call it a prefix. This is probably not super new information, but in case it is, it's the first time for everything. And when when an affix goes after a word linearly to the right of a root or stem, call it a suffix. We also have circumfixes, where you have material which occur together but go on either side. So yes, so sometimes we have circumfixes in which things go to the left and to the right. Never think of the blackboard. Always a good lesson. Okay, so then good. We can also have material go inside a morpheme. So when you have the word fantastic in many varieties of English, you can put in an infix, which I will bowdlerize for YouTube, fan-freaking-tastic. And so you have this full stem fantastic, and then freakin' comes in the middle, and that's an infix. Okay. Fan-bloody-tastic. Yeah, so lots of versions of this. And what's really cool about this is that this is one of these cases where English speakers' tacit knowledge of where syllable boundaries are comes into play, because there's really only one place to put these infixes in English, and not just syllable boundaries, but also facts about stress and things like that. So you can't say fanta-freaking-stick, or fantas-freaking-tick, or anything else, or fa-freaking-tastic. These are not possible. So this is the kind of evidence that that people often use to show what speakers don't know that they know. Okay, good. So affixes. Then we have clitics. So a clitic is very similar to an affix in many ways. However, a clitic is a morpheme that behaves syntactically like a word, but phonologically kind of like an affix. So it cannot be independent phonologically. So let's get some space here. No, this is bad. Undo. Let's get some space here. And let's go back and talk about clitics. So when you have a an affix, you can say certain things about it. So one thing is, say the plural. The plural affix in English spelled S or ES. This selects its host. What does that mean? That means that it needs to go on a noun. It needs to go on the noun that it is expressing the plurality of. So dogs, by putting z on the end of dogs, you're expressing the fact that the dogs are plural. If I were to say dog of, I don't know, war, that's kind of cool sounding, right? Dog of wars, this does not mean that the dog, what's it called? The dog is plural. This means that the war is plural. Or we can say another example. What would be a good example? Eat quickly. If we put ed on the end of this, it didn't mean, well, it doesn't really mean anything because ed has to go on to, or since eat is irregular, let's say chew. Chew quickly. You have to put the ed onto chew rather than onto the whole phrase chew quickly. So because it's a past suffix, it needs to go on the verb. However, a clitic is not like this. So the English possessive is a clitic. So if I say something like, what would be a good example? Friend, the friend of the dog. Lucy's getting a dog, so I have dogs on the brain. I've been seeing all these dog pictures. Okay. Sorry, Lucy. Friend of the dog. So if we wanted to talk about something belongs to the friend of the dog, we would put in an apostrophe S. But it doesn't belong to the dog, it belongs to the friend of the dog. So if this were a suffix, it would go on friend. Just like the plural has to go on the actual noun that it's pluralizing. But here we have the possessive marker going on the end of the whole phrase. And so this is a telltale sign of a clitic. It does not select its host. It is what they call promiscuous. So it will just attach itself to whatever phonological word is beside it. Other ways to distinguish between clitics and affixes is that clitics are compositional. We talked about compositionality with respect to inflection versus derivation. So compositionality, you will recall, maybe I don't know if it's in the same video or not, but compositionality is when the meaning of the whole equals the meaning of the parts put together. So clitics are always compositional. Affixes are not always compositional. So sometimes they give irregularities. They add up to something other than what you'd expect. An example of that is, you have a word like lighten, a verb, and then you have the suffix ing. So we have lightening, the act of lightening, or of making something lighter, and we also have lightning, which has the same kind of source, which is a non-compositional version. So lightning is not just the act of making something lighter, it's also something that comes from the sky and is hurled by Zeus and this kind of thing. So this would never happen with a clitic. So some terminology: if you have a clitic that follows a phrase, then it is an N clitic. So the apostrophe S, enclitic. And if you have one that precedes, you could think of the English indefinite article as a clitic as well, although we don't write it that way. So a friend of dogs, a friend of the dogs. Here we have a proclitic. Why do I always write my P's as R's? Proclitic. And here we have an enclitic. Okay. I think that is good. That's good enough for definitions. I spent way, way, way longer than I thought I was going to on them. So I'm going to, what am I going to do? I'm going to put us back to the full screen and say thanks for listening to all my prattling about definitions. And if you're watching this on YouTube and you like this kind of thing and you don't mind, me bouncing up and down and explaining linguistic stuff, I encourage you to consider subscribing because you'll see more, both bouncing and linguistics. Super exciting. Okay, I'm going to take a moment. I'm going to do my stretches because you must always remain limber when you're about to conlang, especially. And then we're going to go into our analytic language. So I'll be right back.